So today I want to talk about how we can show our models, how we can present them, and a couple techniques and the tools we use in Blender to do that. So our goal when we're presenting is really putting our best face forward. Sometimes I think we get to the end of a project and you're like, man, I'm just so tired. I just want to be done with it. I just want to upload it. But really taking literally sometimes 15 minutes can have the same visual impact as hours worth of modeling or texturing. And to me, it's like not presenting your model as like running 99% of a marathon and then getting to that last little bit and you go, yeah, I'm kind of tired of this marathon. I'm just going to be done. Like presenting is the last step. It's about crossing the finish line and making your work look good. And our goal when we're presenting is to take something, a good looking model that we might look at and say, yeah, that looks pretty good. And really trying to turn it into something that has a nice, appealing kind of look to it. And this is what I'm going to show you how we can do today. So just like in real life, when we're presenting, we need a stage. If you were doing photography for an object or a scene, like in this case, we're doing simple props, we wouldn't shoot it in a big complicated setting. We would try to choose a simple background, something neutral. In fact, if you look at most work on, say, like ArtStation of like character or prop work, unless they're trying to showcase an entire environment, they're almost always shot against very neutral, usually very dark backgrounds in those cases, because we're trying to get the object itself to stand out as clearly as possible. And so the rest of it kind of fades back in. This is a pretty typical photography setup. A couple of lights, a big white background, and it has that kind of roll to it so that we don't get a crease in the corner. So we have this sort of infinite white background to work with. So you might have heard this term before, and it's pretty common if you take in any photography or filmmaking or anything. And I just want to talk about the very most essential type of lighting setup, and that's called three-point lighting. We would have our subject here, usually our camera somewhere in the middle looking forward towards our subject, and we'd have three major lights that are lighting that object. The first is the key light. This is the strongest light. It has the largest intensity. Its color is going to be seen the most, and it's considered the main source of light. We don't want our light coming straight from the camera. We want our light coming off to the side. It creates a more pleasant contrast on our subjects, especially when it comes to things like faces. Three-point lighting is great for. But even for other objects, like having a single light gives us shadows on the surface, and those shadows give us information. Now, you want shadows on the surface, but not too many. That's where the fill light comes in. Usually it's the second strongest light that you're working with, lighting the subject, and it's a light on the opposite side. So it's trying to shine from here onto the opposite side of the object. And its whole goal is to take all the shadows made by the key light and soften them up a little bit. Try to keep them from being too strong or too overwhelming so that we can still see both the lit and relatively unlit side of the model. And then the third is the back, or sometimes called rim light. Usually this is behind the subject, maybe even above them like a halo, or shooting from below them upwards. But the whole goal of this, and this is why it's sometimes called a rim light, is to set the character apart from the background, usually by creating a highlight or a rim or silhouette along their shoulders, over their head, things like that. On our chest, it would be trying to rim the back corner of the chest. So it kind of gives this like nice sharp white contrast that pops it out from the background. It gives your image a sense of depth. Now, the fourth of these that sometimes is used is an actual background light. Like in the case of an infinity wall, or in this case, like I have a green screen behind me, you usually want to light those. They have nice even light on them as well. Otherwise, you get a lot of shadows and things like that. But it also, because it's in this case, like a big white plane in the background, can bounce a lot of, we call global illumination in CG, but it can bounce a lot of light back in the scene and just sort of fill the volume with a sense of overall light. So this is the kind of lighting we're going to try to set up today. Now, we're going to do that with these kinds of lighting. So we have these, there's like different types of lights, but I really want to show you these two in primarily. It's the point light, which is saying that we have a light at a single point and it radiates out equally in all directions. All that matters is how intense it is and how wide its effect is. And then the spotlight, which has its origin point and then a cone that it projects. It has its blend factor, which is how far does it fall off. So beyond this point, you can't see the light anymore. And in here, it's its most intense. So the smaller this inner cone is, the softer the fall off is. The tighter those two cones are together, the harsher the light's going to appear because it's going to be a much sharper fall off. We have the overall distance that this thing goes. And when it gets beyond this little cone, is sort of where we clip, like it no longer sees, it can't get any further through. So let's swap into Blender and let's make a little scene for ourselves. So Shift A, let's put in a plane because I'm going to make my whole scene or my stage. I'm going to scale this up quite a bit. I like to make this a pretty big infinity wall because, well, it doesn't cost us anything. And let's make sure we're forward in the Y and we're looking back at the X-axis. And I'm just going to take this little object right here, hit E, and then middle click to drag it up in my Z-axis. Now with this selected, I go into my modifier, I go to a bevel, and I could do a bevel manually, but I like setting this one because it's pretty easy to just adjust it if I do or don't like how sharp this thing is. It's really easy to come in and make some changes to it. Now I right click this background because we can see the straight lines on it, and we want to say shade smooth. It's just going to transition each faceted face from one to another a lot smoother. And before we move on to anything else, let's go ahead and throw a new material on it just to make sure it's a nice white material. We could like tone it down a little bit if we want to, and make sure it's a really rough material. So roughness is the factor of how rough is it. One means it's totally rough versus something like if I turn on my lighting here, if I was all the way down, we can see it's very shiny. We want it to be very rough. So let's go back to this. Now let's put a subject in the scene. I'm gonna go and just throw a simple UV sphere in here to take a look at so we can compare things off of, and let's give it a new material as well, just so we have something to play with. And right click and shade this smooth so we can have a nice sphere. If I press this button, we'll see this is viewport shading. This is displays render preview, and now it's actually showing me what the shading would look like. And so let's go ahead and set up our lights. I have one light, which is just a regular point light. And the way I like to set these up is let's go to the top view and replicate that graph. This is going to be my front, so I'm going to move my camera over and maybe rotate it because I'm going to want it facing forward. We'll talk about the camera in a second. But I want my key light, and I'm going to hit Shift D and make my fill light, and Shift D, and this will be my rim light, and Shift D, and this will be my backdrop light. Now, these are all in position, and actually let's delete this one for now. Here's what I like to do though, and this is why I'm doing it this way, is because I like to start, even if I want these eventually to be spotlights, I like to start them as point lights because I don't have to point them. I get to try out like contrasts and levels and colors. So I'm going to set my rim light in the back pretty high. I'm going to set my fill light coming in a little bit lower, and I want to set my key light above the subject, but not quite as strongly. Now these are all evenly intense, so I want to tone that down a little bit. Let's choose my fill light. And let's go into my light object data, and I'm going to drop that down to, let's say 800 for now, and maybe I'll take this light up to like 1200. So this is wattage, and you can always look up values of like cameras. I'm going to take this a lot down too. So maybe this is like a good 300, make it a lot lower and a lot more subtle. So I can also, now that I have these in place, let's go ahead and I can change the light source right here to spotlight. Now I have this little widget that I can grab and just move into place, and I can choose how wide the cone is by dragging this little arrow. I can choose how soft it is by changing this bend, so let's change these two to spotlight as well. So let's make this, I like to make this as the key light, so I should want to get a pretty good cone on this. I want to soften it up a little. And then this back one, again, spotlight, and we want this to be really shining down on the lamp. And I'm going to make this one a little tighter in its focus because I want to get this idea. We can see here if I increase the power of this lamp by just dragging it up a little bit. We get this a little shading kind of on the corner, which is more or less what we're looking for. So I got that little rim right there. And let's take this object and I take the roughness down a little bit. I can get a sense of how this is shining on it. Now in this case, the rim light, another light I can talk about is area, and I like area for these rim lights. An area light has a new factor, which is how wide, like what's the size of it. And this is great because we can just kind of click and drag these, and it sort of projects from a rectangle. These are kind of costlier. They're like expensive. They take more processing power, but we can see instead of giving me a round highlight, it gives me this like really cool, like curved over it. So this is going to really help this object kind of pop out from this background. And then if I want a backlight, so let's go ahead and back into the top. Let's maybe duplicate this light, and I'm going to move it here. And this one, I'm just going to shine at the back wall, and I want to make this real intense. Let's do like, I'm going to go like crazy, like 3000 with it, and go pretty big and pretty wide. Something like that. And so what this gives me is when I'm looking at the scene, now this light is keeping, if I turn this off, it gets really dark in the background of this, and just help me get a little bit more lighting to my set and not quite as deep or dark. I might even go up as like, say this is a really powerful light because it has to go really far. The further it goes, the dimmer it gets. So there, I got some basic lighting, and I have something that's going to look a lot nicer now. Now, lights don't just have intensity, they have color. So here are 3 different examples of the same sphere that I've rendered out. And we can see here's what we've been working with is just white light. And over here, I have colored light. So what I find though is out of all of these, a little bit of color to your light can create like a nice appealing look. Like if you look at all 3 of these, after seeing this one, you could look closely and see, oh, there is kind of an orange and a blue here. Remember back to when we talked about color a couple days ago, and I talked about like contrasting those two. But this white light is, it's nice, but it's a little bland. By adding a little bit of color, it's a little bit more interesting. So back into my scene here, I can come in with this, and I like to start by going really intense with my colors, like as intense as I can get away with them. So I'm going to create this color scheme, and you could even use the coolers to like create those color schemes. I'm going to leave these 2 white. I mean, I could take this and push it a little bit more yellow or something like that. Maybe I'll contrast this background with the rim. Like I'll make like a purple rim. And we see like, it's cool, but man, it's pretty distracting. Also, it'd be nice is I'm going to name these really quick so I can just click them and I know which one is which. So this is fill. You can also click any of these and hit F2. And it brings up our little lighting guy here. So F2, and this is back. So now I can look at this and say, well, now I've taken all this, but let's start pulling these back a little bit. So I'm gonna take this backlight, and using these sliders, this is saturation, I can just pull the saturation back. So it's just gonna have a little bit of yellow, but not too much. Now I take that rim, and I pull the saturation back. So it's just got a little bit of purple. So it's gonna contrast with it, but not too much. Let's take that fill, same deal, just pull the saturation back just till we can barely notice that there's a blue on this. And then we take our key, we do the same thing, and we've created a lighting scheme that's just a little bit more interesting because it has a little bit more color depth to it. Then let's talk about the camera. The camera is this object. It's represented by this symbol, which shows the way it's pointing as well as the up direction for the camera, like which way it thinks is rendered up. And it can be hard to position without looking through it, which is why we can actually lock to the view. But we can also create a separate view for our camera. And I'll show you how to do that. So we can actually align our current view, going view, align view, active camera. And then we can lock that camera to view so we can move it by itself, which is pretty convenient. So I line myself up in a place that I like. I can go to camera and I can come up to view and align view and align active camera to view. So now I'm looking through my camera. If I rotate away from it, I'm no longer looking at my camera. If I click this little symbol, I'm looking back through my camera. But if we press N on our keyboard and come over to View tab here, we could say Lock Camera to View. And what this is going to let us do is now when we navigate, we're actually changing where the camera's looking, letting us position it while we look through it. But let's say I want to move around the scene and I want to move and set stuff. Well, it's going to be really annoying if I have to keep clicking this button to come out of it, clicking this button to go back into it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually make a second window. This is one of the things that's really cool about Blender. If I go up to the top where this double arrow is, and I just right click over it, and I choose vertical split, you can see I can actually create two windows here. So in this one, I'm going to look through the camera, and I'm going to click this button, which is show overlays. So now it just shows me just the lighting. And in here, I can set and now move, and I can make changes and adjustments to lights. And while I'm moving here, I can be looking on the left side and seeing how it affects my overall lighting. So it's easy to navigate or move or change things, but I'm always still looking at what my final lighting is going to be. Then we get down to the actual render. There's two major places you want to look for settings when it comes to the render. One is this little tab, which is our render engine scene tab. And then this one is like our output tab. Mainly in here is where you're going to change like how the renderer works. We use a renderer in this class. We're going to use what's called the Eevee render. It's a real-time render, which means unlike traditional renders like Cycles that they have in there, or something like Arnold or RenderMan that they use on like big animated movies, those can take minutes to entire days to render single scenes. Something called like Eevee is a real-time render, meaning it works the way a game engine works, which means it renders really nice stuff, but it does it instantly or close to instantly. So I'm going to go through these in a second, but we also have in our render settings mostly things about output, file formats, where things are going to get loaded up. But let's take a look really quick. So at any time, I can press F12 on my keyboard or come up to render image, and it's going to render out what my current image is right now. And from here, I can go to image and I can save it onto my hard drive. But if I come into this tab, this top one, our render properties tab, we can see that I'm in Eevee, which is the render we want to be in, and I have lots of settings. Let's take the render and we can change the number of samples. This is how many times does it refresh the image. And so we see viewport right now, this is our preview, is set to lower because it makes it faster. And if things are starting to get slower, you can always crank this number down. If we take it down to like something really low, it gets like a little noisier in the scene. We see it gets a little messier. If I take it up something higher to something like 64, we see our preview, our real-time view kind of smooths things out. But I'm setting my preview here a lot higher. But we can also start turning on some things in here like ambient occlusion, which is like the little drop shadows. So if I lower this in the z-axis and I get it closer to something, we'll see the ambient occlusion becomes a little bit more clear. I guess it's a little hard to see on this object, but it's basically those little bumps between things. So I can change up the distance. It works like a shadow in the scene. I can set up the bloom, which is sort of like this filtering, like the way too much light hits a camera. Of course, we could set this way too high, which we probably don't want to do. So it's best to be, just play with these settings a little bit. I think for now, you could really just take that bloom and just click it on, and it just makes a subtle little difference. Then we have things like screen space reflections, which let us bounce light around the surface, which is really nice. And motion blur, although we don't have anything really moving here. Let's set the rest of these like as they are. And then in our output settings, of course, 1920 by 1080 is the standard. So with these on now, I can press F12 again, and it takes a little longer, but my image is going to be a little bit better. So let's go ahead and let's pull this off. And I got one more thing that I want to show you in this scene that I want to show you how to do. And because it feels like the render should be last up, but not quite. We can actually composite all of our image stuff right in Blender. And I just want to show you how this tool works. You don't have to get super deep into it, but I want to show you the kind of difference it can make. This is what kind of takes, like, I think a bland image like this and turns it into a really cool looking, fun image. And if you've ever played with like a compositor for film, or you played with like Photoshop, this is kind of what this is from. A lot of artists will just take it straight out of Blender and throw it into Photoshop. You could totally do that too. That's not cheating. That's making your image look better. But Blender has one built in. So let's come to the compositing tab. And what we have is our current setup. So the first thing I'm going to notice in this tab is it's just got this big screen. There's nothing here. But if I click Use Nodes, it's going to bring in my most previous render. So I've got this little preview window in here, and it's not really showing me what I want. It's a little hard to see in there. So if I hold Control Shift and I left click this, it's actually going to put through this little viewer node, it's going to put this whole object into my background, which is really cool. So now if I hit Shift and A, and I have all of these different filters. These are fun to play with, and you might recognize some of these, like hue, saturation value, like a tone mapper. There's a lot of cool stuff in here, like we can adjust the brightness and contrast. So let's go ahead, and I'm going to add this and click it onto the viewer. So it's just going through the viewer right now, and I can change or alter things like the brightness or the contrast of our scene. I can hit Control A and let's take a look at like one or two of the other ones. I like this is like a master color corrector. It's got a lot of stuff in it. I can take this color balance, which I really like to use because this is like a scope that I'm used to and like my video editing software. And so lift is like, this is what my highlights are going to be. So I can bring my highlights up a little bit. I can bring my shadows down a little bit. And I usually like to lower my, I can change my gamma like up or lower. But what we can do is we can also push the color. So I can take my shadows a little bluer. I can take my highlights a little oranger, like that's going way too far, but I can take my brightest colors a little higher, like so. And maybe I can push in the gamma here. I can play around with this a little bit, but like even push a little bit green if I want to create like something interesting like that. And so we have a bunch of these little tabs and things like that that we can keep adding to things that are really like a cool way of changing up like what we can see. And when we're done, we want to take this little node and drag it out so it also goes to the compositor. And then if I hit 12, now it's getting my rendered image with my color correction and my compositing on it. So this is like a really fun thing to just play around with. And I find when you've spent so much time and worked really hard to make like a cool piece of art, taking that extra couple minutes to just like play with some of these settings, see what can be done. I mean, and seriously, check around out there. This is just, for all of this, we're just scratching the surface. This is just week 1. So we just want to get you a sense of like, this exists and this is how it can work. So take some time with your models. Most of you are already done with modeling. The coloring won't take that long. I really want to see you take some time to make it look really cool and find interesting ways of presenting it. So can't wait to see what everyone comes up with, and I'll see you next week.